I think you're giving Cedar Point too much credit for planning ahead, when the simplest explanation is that this was a last-minute panic decision because of the Top Thrill 2 troubles. This comment and many like it seem to be permeating the coaster community. There seems to be this common belief about Siren's curse and how it played out. And while I don't claim to know anything really, I'd like to present an alternate opinion about what really is the actual simplest explanation about Siren's curse. And it isn't what you think. Before we can dive into what I think happened, first I think we need to explain what the coaster reporter was talking about with this comment and the larger narrative I'm seeing online with the coaster community at large. There aren't very many of these Vekoma tilt coasters in the wild. The only one in operation is in Taiwan. So people were excited when in 2022, a contract was signed for Energylandia to get the only other tilt coaster in the world. Though in 2023, it was announced that Vekoma would be canceling their contract to build a tilt coaster in the park. In May of 2024, Cedar Point debuted their Top Thrill 2 coaster, though to a litany of supposed issues that shut it down after only 8 days, and it hasn't reopened for the rest of the year. Then in July of 2024, a red track was spotted in the parking lot of a Six Flags Mexico. The track's style led people to conclude that it was a Vekoma track, which then led them to believe that this was the tilt coaster that was abandoned by Energylandia and that it was now destined to be installed in Six Flags Mexico. Then, in the past couple of weeks with the announcement of Siren's curse, the narrative then turned to Cedar Point making a panic decision and stealing this coaster from Six Flags Mexico in order to appease people due to the extremely poor PR due to the Top Thrill 2 conundrum. So that's it. This ride is nothing more than a multi-million-dollar solution to pave over a PR issue caused by last year's coaster. After all, that is the simplest explanation, isn't it? Let's dive into why I don't think this simple explanation really makes a ton of sense. The first and most important thing to know is that while there is a prevailing sentiment that this tilt coaster arriving to Cedar Point is the same one as Energylandia's, there is, as far as I can tell, no actual evidence to prove this is the case. Everything in the discussion is complete and pure conjecture from the coaster community, but it seems to have been taken hold as a solid fact. So let's back up and look at some of the details a little bit closer. The first is some statistics about these rides. Firstly, the ride that was to be built at Energylandia seems to line up, based on the description of the contract, to be a variation of the off-the-shelf cliffhanger style of coaster that is advertised on Vekoma's website. This coaster sits at 45 meters or 147 feet and shares the same features as described in the contract. Siren's Curse, being built at Cedar Point, is a similar layout to the cliffhanger design, except that it will rise to a height of 160 feet, or slightly over 10 feet taller. And while this may not seem incredibly different on the surface, from a manufacturing standpoint, it makes this a very different coaster. The pitch of the incline will be steeper, the supports may need to be changed to account for different G-forces and plenty of other considerations. Next, let's look at the ride that arrived at Six Flags Mexico. It was never confirmed that Six Flags Mexico would be building this new ride. It was also never actually confirmed what type of track that it was. It was also never confirmed where it came from. All we really know is that some track that could potentially belong to a Vekoma coaster was sitting at Six Flags Mexico. A lot of the discussion around why it would be stored there if it was meant for Cedar Point has been had because it's a long way out of the way. But I want to come back to that later when I actually get to what I think happened, because I think there's an explanation for that makes a lot of sense. So let's be clear. I do think that the track seen at Six Flags Mexico is the sections of the Vekoma track that was to become Siren's Curse. But I'm not sold that it's the same track as the Energylandia coaster, nor am I sold that it was intended to actually be built at Six Flags Mexico. Next, let's look at the claims that Cedar Point did this as a PR response. There are two portions of this discussion. The first is the PR disaster that has been Top Thrill 2, and the second is the announcement of a new coaster. So, the PR disaster. I want to remind everyone that Top Thrill 2 in itself is actually a response to a PR disaster. This ride was never actually supposed to exist. Top Thrill was closed due to a graphic injury that occurred on Top Thrill in 2021, which meant that they had to close the ride and transform it into Top Thrill 2, which was intended to be a much safer coaster. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way, but that was the intention. Remember that if there was no breakdown of Top Thrill in 2021, then there would be no Top Thrill 2 3 years later. Now, about the announcement of a new coaster. New coasters are multi-million-dollar investments. The optics of Top Thrill 2 being closed would not necessarily be a reason to introduce a new coaster unless those optics actually caused a hit to attendance, income, or stock price. All three of which I don't believe have actually occurred. So, while the optics of Top Thrill 2 aren't fantastic, it's not a crisis that's worth millions of dollars. It's just a season that they're trying to work through. The other thing to consider is that developing a roller coaster is not something that happens very quickly. In fact, construction of large projects in general doesn't happen very quickly. The typical design cycle for a ground-up roller coaster is at least 2 years and often 3 or more. It takes time because there's a large number of steps to be done, like finding a space or demolishing existing structure to make room, letting manufacturers and ride designers bid for contracts, letting civil engineers survey the space, designing an initial ride for park approval, getting a bid package together, getting permits, doing construction design documents, and then actually building the thing. This is a process that takes a ton of time to do. Projects rarely happen very fast if there's any kind of permitting or engineer stamps required because there are legal requirements that have to be met. So if we're looking at the panic decision angle, then that would put this PR disaster occurring in late May, and then park management meeting with Six Flags leadership in June and deciding to make the gamble to purchase the ride from Vekoma for maybe 30% off of the $12 million price that Energylandia was going to pay. Then, in only 3 months' time, getting civil engineers to survey the land, getting permits, doing construction document design, getting construction bids, and everything pretty much except actually building the thing. A process that usually takes more than a year, done in a few short months. When you add up the entire timeline of everything that's happened, I can't see how the coaster community can piece this together into the story that it has. However, when you really start digging into the details, I think it really starts to fall apart. Instead, what I think has happened is a large-scale case of a string of illusory correlations, where a number of unrelated events have played themselves out in a way that makes them seem correlated, even though they never were. So with that said, I want to go all the way back and replay this from the beginning about how Siren's Curse actually came to be the announcement for Cedar Point in 2025. Cedar Point began demolishing the dorms, also known as the location where Siren's Curse would ultimately land, in 2019. So, if we were following a typical construction timeline for building a ride, this could potentially indicate that they intended to build something new in that area for the 2021 season. Now, whether or not this coaster was meant to be what is now Siren's Curse or not, or even if it was going to be a coaster at all, I'm not 100% sure, but let's just say that it was. And if that is the case, then that lays out a very distinct picture of what Cedar Point's development timeline was going to be. In 2018, they opened Steel Vengeance. Then in 2019, they demolished the dorms for the new 2021 coaster. Then in 2023, they wanted to open up the boardwalk alongside the Wild Mouse, and probably their next coaster in 2025, replacing Snake River Falls. A steady 2 to 3 year pace for building new attractions, something that's been very typical of the park for decades. But then something happened during the time between demolishing the dorms in 2019 and building the coaster in 2021 that changed their plans. Let's see. Was there anything in the year 2020 that could cause a major disruption like that?
The city at the center of the outbreak in China and 2 others going on lockdown.
The risk is low in the United States. The risk is low.
So at least 565 people are dead and more than...
COVID changed the plan. Because of the shutdowns inflicted by COVID, the park was both struggling for cash flow and unable to take on the large-scale construction due to the limitations caused by the epidemic. So, Cedar Point probably made the decision to delay the announcement of this new coaster until 2022 instead of 2021. Not that big of a deal. Now they could just open the new Siren's Curse in 2022, Boardwalk in 2023, and then Snake River Falls in 2025. They would use the 2021 season to get up some cash flow to fund and everything that would just keep the coaster under wraps until then. But obviously the coaster wasn't built in 2022. So something else caused a disruption to their plans. Oh yeah, a PR crisis called Top Thrill Dragster. When Top Thrill Dragster injured a park visitor, permanently disfiguring her and causing her to need assistance for the rest of her life, there were 2 things that became clear. First is that the park was in for a very, very expensive lawsuit, as the injuries of this type rarely settle for under the tens of millions of dollars. And the other is that Top Thrill Dragster could not keep operating in its current condition. One of Cedar Point's top coasters, an iconic figure of its skyline and an important piece to the park's identity, needed to shut down for either demolition or rehabilitation. Okay, so change of plans again. We need to rehabilitate Top Thrill Dragster. What can we do? All right, let's begin work on Top Thrill 2 so we can solve the PR crisis by showing that we're taking the injury of this woman seriously by actually fixing the issues with the ride. In order to do that, we need to get some cash, so let's adjust our schedule for new attractions. We can still continue to work on our planned expansion of the boardwalk area, but let's plan our new rehab version of Top Thrill 2 to follow that up in 2024. Because we need the cash flow for the lawsuit and rehab, let's shelf Siren's Curse for now and slate it for 2025, and then move the Snake River Falls replacement until after that. So the coaster, originally intended to open in 2021, was put on the shelf until 2025. And if a ride was going to sit on the to-do list for that long, then Cedar Point needed to try and keep it under wraps. Then the merger happened and Cedar Fair became Six Flags, which gave them a new opportunity. As they began to bring this new project into fruition, they still wanted to keep the secrecy of the project that they've had on the table for 4 years now. They knew some of the best marketing that they could do for this coaster would be have it be a total shock. So, instead of their typical move of bringing in the parts to Sandusky, they instead had the parts shipped to a more separated property that they had control over in order to keep the scent of what was happening off their tail. And this is why we saw the parts show up in a parking lot in Mexico. And this is also why Cedar Point had the shock of the century with their announcement. No one saw it coming because they didn't want you to see it coming, because keeping it a secret has been a goal of theirs for 4 years now. This entire process explains why there were no new rides built between 2018 and 2023. It was never their intention, it was just the way that Cedar Point needed to deal with the cards that they were dealt. So the simplest explanation is one of Cedar Point stealing a ride from another park for a bargain in order to pave over a supposed PR nightmare. A multi-million-dollar solution that they just happened to have the space for due to the dorms that they happened to demolish over 5 years prior and left empty for seemingly no particular reason. The more complicated solution is that Siren's Curse, or something like it, was always the plan, and a string of unrelated events has caused its development to be delayed for years now, and we're just now seeing the results of that. So, that's my theory, and I get it. I don't think I've seen this narrative anywhere else in the community, and so I'm probably in the minority here. But I'm open to alternate opinions here. What do you think? Let me know in your comments below. I would have loved to include this in my original video about Siren's Curse, but time was of the essence there. I was going out of town for the weekend, so I wrote, shot, and edited that video in only 2.5 hours, and I did not have the time to quite include everything that I wanted to. But given a little more time to think about it, I wanted to make a follow-up video and talk about it in this sense. So hopefully you guys like it and have some quality constructive commentary in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget that you are beautifully and wonderfully made, and you are loved. See you next time.